Chapter 4, Hermosillo. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived in Hermosillo. We stopped at the main intersection to allow a group of school children wearing blue blazers and knee pants to cross the street. They were accompanied by patrolmen carrying a yellow and white stop sign held up high. When the elderly man lowered the sign, the cars resumed their erratic movement, honking as they made their way through the intersection. With the windows rolled down, I could hear the bells of bicycles, car engines, and barking dogs. We passed houses with potted geranium plants decorating their tile steps, and ornate wrought iron fences and gates protecting the entrances. Carpets of burgundy bougainvillea covered parts of the tile rooftops, wrapping themselves around chimney stacks, or hanging in thick clusters from trellises or balcony railings. Carlos parked the car near the plaza made of a circular park with benches and a gazebo in the center. "Let's stretch our legs for a moment," he said. "I want to stop at a bakery I know and buy some bread and also some fruit before heading on to Guaymas." I was relieved to be able to get out of the car and walk before continuing our journey. The chili peppers I had eaten in Santa Ana had upset my stomach and I needed to go to the restroom badly. "Now don't go following me in with your notebook," I said seriously. Carlos laughed. "It was my friend, Larry, who did the study. I only assisted him on a few occasions." Along our drive, Carlos had entertained me with a story of how a friend of his at the university was interested in studying toilet behavior, cross-culturally. To this effect, Larry kept a notebook on people's activities in restrooms. He had accurate records on who went into the public facilities, how long they spent at the urinals or in the cubicles, whether they wrote graffiti on the walls, how much toilet paper was consumed during each occurrence, whether they flushed, and if so how many times, and when possible, information on whether they wiped themselves from the front to the back, or the back to front, and so on. His friend had complied quite a bit of data, complete with drawings, on the subject of restroom activity, and had submitted his proposal to the National Institute for Mental Health for a research grant. Unfortunately, the cross-cultural study on toilet behavior was not approved due to cutbacks in government funding. "I wouldn't mind living in this town," I said to Carlos after I came out of the restroom and we were walking toward a small park. "Everything is so lush and clean." "Back there in Santa Ana, I got the impression that you didn't like Mexico," Carlos said while stopping to tie his shoe. "That's because I thought I was eating dog meat. This is a beautiful place." "Where do the people work?" "In the fields, or in the mines in the hills, or in construction," Carlos said. While driving into town, I had seen plenty of evidence of construction work. Everywhere people were building or refurbishing buildings. It was obvious that there was no shortage of masons, carpenters, and plasterers here. Near the park, workers were digging a huge pit perhaps to lay new pipes or to repair an old sewage system. "I used to work in construction," I said with a touch of pride. Carlos looked at me in surprise. "You don't seem like the redneck type," he said laughing. "I worked for one, though, as an apprentice, although I knew a lot more about carpentry than he apparently did. Lamont was working on a remodeling project and hired me to be his assistant, provided that I didn't complain about his radio that he kept on full blast on the country music station, and his foul language, a habit he had picked up in Vietnam." "What type of things did you build?" "Our first project was a redwood deck, using no nails whatsoever, only nuts and bolts. Quite a challenge. You see, he was a Buddhist from a commune in Oregon and he was convinced that to use nails would desecrate the wood. I really needed the money, so I tolerated his eccentricities, the loud radio, his beer guzzling, his profanity, and his body odor. Whenever I wanted to quit, he kept telling me that I was working with a master carpenter who had no peers in the construction world, and that I should be paying him for his guidance." "Sounds like quite a character," Carlos said. He was. After weeks he still didn't trust me to use his power tools, which he dusted and oiled every night. I realized it was a situation of observing, hauling lumber, and sweeping up sawdust. That doesn't sound too exciting. It wasn't. Lamont had promised me hands-on experience, but the only actual hands-on experience I ever received throughout the entire project was his prods and pinches to various parts of my anatomy. I was so desperate, I developed a severe allergy to sawdust and began having fits of sneezing. I was going to hang in there for the rest of the summer, but the situation went from bad to worse. What happened? Carlos asked, concerned. He kept insisting I come to his house to see the new kitchen cabinets he had installed, and share a joint of marijuana while listening to some Willie Nelson tapes. Well, I knew what that meant and realized the situation had become hopeless. I quit, and with the money I had saved, I entered the university, where things weren't all that much better where men were concerned, if you know what I mean. Carlos didn't reply one way or the other. Let's look into some of the shops, Carlos suggested, stepping aside to avoid a hole in the ground. Do you need to buy any gifts for friends or relatives? I don't have any. Friends or relatives? Carlos inquired. Neither. He looked at me and shook his head. He sang the line of a Mexican song. No tengo ni madre ni padre, ni un perro que ladra. I have no mother or father, not even a dog that barks. That about sums up my situation, I said. I don't have any parents either, Carlos said. And I've learned that to have friends is too restricting. You always end up trying to please them or to fulfill their expectations. They pin you down. You're lucky to be an orphan. I wasn't an orphan, but I did not bother to correct Carlos' false impression. I realized that I wanted him to think I had no one in the world. It made me appear independent and mysterious. Besides, I had never felt I was a part of my family anyway. As a child, I had always imagined that I was a changeling. A nurse must have gotten me mixed up in the hospital with the hundreds of other babies of the post-war baby boom. At least, that was what I used to tell myself. We entered one of the shops that lined the arcade around the plaza. It had the typical ceramic and leather goods you would find in any shop in Mexico, but in one corner, half hidden by a postcard rack, I found a thick wool poncho with braided fringe. I wanted to buy it, but Carlos insisted on paying for it himself. He said that it was a good idea to get it because even though the days were hot, the nights in Sonora were cool. After some casual browsing, we headed for the bakery that Carlos affirmed was the best in Sonora. You mean you've sampled bread from all of them? I teased. Practically, he said, but from his lean, muscular physique, it was hard to believe that he had overindulged in baked goods. On our way to the bakery, we had to detour around another deep pit in road that sprang in front of us so suddenly that I nearly fell in and would have had Carlos not grabbed me by the arm and pulled me aside. We almost lost you, there, he laughed. This isn't Los Angeles, where there are sidewalks and where the cars will stop for dazed pedestrians. Around here you have to watch where you're going. I flushed with embarrassment as I realized that with my martial arts and sorcery training, I was still a walking zombie. I seemed to operate on the assumption that whoever I was with knew where they were going, and therefore I didn't have to pay attention. It was also true while driving. I trusted my companions implicitly and never knew how I got wherever I ended up. This was particularly true when that companion was male. Unwittingly, it was a subtle way of relinquishing control to the opposite sex. I knew it was a dangerous way of proceeding. I remembered Clara's warning that in the sorcerer's world, everything was important and that I always had to be attentive to details and assume responsibility for my actions. I kept my eyes downcast and avoided the pits and ruts in the road. I noticed that Carlos was exceedingly fleet-footed. His exquisite natural balance and prowess gave him an easy stride. For a while, I tried to imitate his style of walking. Whereas I moved from the hips with little flexibility in my knees and ankles, Carlos flexed his knees and ankles and rolled off the balls of his feet, achieving a smooth feline sprint. Copying his stride, I deliberately flexed my knees and shifted my weight more toward the front of my feet, rather than landing heavy on my heels the way I normally walked. After a while, my calves began to ache. I felt I was using them for the first time in months. The last time I pushed them to the limit was when I was walking with Clara in the hills near her house. I could never keep up with her pace, but walking with her had rid me, at least temporarily, of the doctor's shuffle, as Clara had called my way of walking. Doctors, she had insisted, had a distinctive shuffle, moving from the hips, as they sauntered from their consultation rooms to the examination room, or down the corridors of hospitals, which Clara claimed was the most they ever walk in their lives. They all have bad knees, she said, expounding on her generalization. It was not something I was prepared to dispute, for I had to agree that the few doctors I had come into contact with, including my own family physician, fell into her category of shuffling as they walked. I was aware that, having been away from Clara's influence, I had again lapsed into my old habits, including my lazy hip walking pattern, shuffling along as if my listless legs resented the burden of having to carry my body to a place neither they nor I wanted to go. "What's the matter with your walk?" Carlos asked, concerned. "Did you injure your ankle back there on the road?" I realized trying to imitate his sprint made my stride appear awkward and uneven. One of my legs was actually dragging behind the other in an attempt to keep up with my head and shoulders. "Sit here while I go get the bread," he said, pointing at an iron bench across from the gazebo. "I'll go with you," I offered. "No," he said firmly. I had the distinct feeling he didn't want to be seen in my company. Obediently, I sat on the bench and watched him enter the store marked Panaderia across the street. Through the glass window, I could see him talking to a beautiful woman, perhaps in her late 20s, whom I assumed was a customer. She was elegantly dressed, in a fashionable lime green blouse and beige skirt, not a white uniform one would expect a bakery attendant to be wearing. I could see her attire, because I moved closer to the door and actually peeked through the window. Then I saw Carlos hugging her in a most affectionate manner as she gave him the bag of bread he came for. Then she turned, looked at me, and before I could hide, she winked at me as if she knew me. I rushed back to the bench in the nick of time, and pretended to be tying my shoelaces, but as I peeked up I could see the woman had accompanied him to the door and was waving goodbye to Carlos and then to me across the road. A strange anger possessed me. I was fuming. What was going on? How is it that people seem to know me when I don't remember them? It couldn't just be coincidence that which women in the restaurant and now this beauty in the bakery. I felt there was a conspiracy going on and I was somehow at the center of it. I remembered how Clara and Mr. Abelar tricked me in the past. They followed my movements from way back, and when I thought I met them for the first time, they already knew me intimately. The same thing was happening now, and it all began in the anthropology department when I suspected that I met Carlos before. I must have met him before, because otherwise why would I be having a fit of jealousy now, as if he belonged to me from olden times? I tried telling myself that the woman was no doubt only a casual acquaintance of his and hugged him only because people south of the border are more demonstrative than in the United States. Yet I couldn't help thinking that the woman wasn't Mexican at all, only very deeply tanned. I wondered who that gorgeous woman was and why Carlos didn't want me to go with him into the bakery, and why she waved at me. "Let's move to another bench," Carlos said. "It's shadier over there by those trees." But I knew the real reason for moving was that he was hiding something. I was distraught to realize Carlos was a man with many secrets. Not that I didn't have secrets myself, which I wouldn't dream of revealing. Yet I had the unreasonable expectation that others had to be completely candid with me. We walked to the other side of the plaza and sat down on an identical white wrought iron bench, only this one faced the opposite direction of the bakery, which was completely hidden by the foliage of trees. "Why is that your favorite bakery?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Carlos grinned mischievously. "Because they make such delicious bread," he said, handing me a round flat loaf sprinkled with pink sugar. "It must be the water or the flour they use. Try it and tell me if it isn't so." I attacked the bread with a ferocity that surprised me, but I had to admit it was delicious. The rolls were a world apart from the bread in the United States. The sugar coating sweetened my disposition, and I decided not to ask about the bakery or the lovely woman I wasn't supposed to have seen. She was one of those secrets I hoped would be revealed in time. Carlos took out a bottle of mineral water from the sack and from his pocket, a Swiss Army knife which had a bottle opener attached to it along with 6 or 7 other sharp implements. He pried off the cap and handed it to me. I finished the bread, then looked inside the bag to find 4 more small round loaves, each with a different color sugar coating. I picked out a green one. It tasted like the pink one. The coloring was not a different flavoring but merely food color. Why did you decide to become an anthropologist? I asked, taking a sip of mineral water. Because the study of man is one of the most important endeavors one can engage in. Especially studying man's belief systems, his cognitive structures, his culture as he lives it. I'm particularly interested in a phenomenological approach to the study of man. What do you mean by a phenomenological approach? A phenomenological approach to anthropology or sociology would be to take a person and leave them here in Hermosillo to see how they went about interpreting a foreign culture. Are you planning on leaving me here? I asked in a moment of panic. To see how I fare? Carlos laughed. No. I was referring to an experiment I had cooked up with a professor in the sociology department. Not speaking the language or being familiar with the customs, he was going to live here in Hermosillo for a while, and I would be the observer and guardian to make certain that no real harm came to him. The premise was that as he went through his daily tasks of trying to arrange the world in recognizable terms, the taken for granted aspects of the world would, by their disruption, reveal themselves. They would make themselves available for investigation. I don't get it, I said, taking another bite of bread. In every simple act he would have to find the natural order of phenomenon that for him, because he lacked membership, would be chaotic. In other words, he would have to create order in his day-to-day existence. This process of creating order would be the subject matter for our investigation. Since the professor's interest was the study of norms and how they are constituted in our daily lives, I thought it was a terrific plan, right up his alley. Did you do it? No. We were all set to leave for Mexico when he backed out at the last minute. Why was that? He kept thinking of all the contingencies. He was afraid of contracting some horrendous disease, or of being shot or robbed. All sorts of prejudices and personal considerations came into the picture, and so he never left Los Angeles, where he felt he was on familiar, and therefore safe, ground. It would have been a great study, I said, then I had a frightening thought. Are you sure I'm not the guinea pig this time? Carlos leaned over. We're all guinea pigs in the hands of power, he whispered. Just then a crow perched on top of the gazebo and started cawing. Carlos gestured to it with a nod. A reaffirmation, he said. I still don't see how that ties in with phenomenology, I said, getting back to the discussion at hand. Phenomenology takes the tacit faith we have in the reality of our everyday world and makes this the principal subject for investigation, Carlos explained. Exactly what tacit faith are you referring to? I asked. Carlos thought for a moment as if to find the right words. For example, our assumption that the world is shared, that it is the same world for all normal individuals. Also, that there is a temporal and spatial continuity to things. Isn't that true? Not necessarily. Sorcerers like Don Juan don't see the world the same way you or I do. Their training and membership in the sorcerer's tradition enables them to see the world in entirely different terms. Phenomenology questions the assumption that the world is intersubjectively shared by members. Or rather makes that sharing the subject matter of its investigation. It also questions the a priori that what we call reality has a natural history, a causal basis which allows us to reasonably expect the world to continue in the future in much the same way it has in the past. Are you saying the world won't continue in the future as it has in the past? We don't know, but the fact that we assume that it does is prime matter for phenomenological investigation. These are presuppositions that cannot be accepted outright, but need to be the focus of investigation. Carlos talked about his interest in Husserl and Heidegger and the French phenomenologist, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I told him about a sociology class I had taken taught by a professor in the sociology department, who had devised a method for studying social interaction using a phenomenological approach. He called his deviant approach to study social interaction ethnomethodology. That was the professor I was going to take to Mexico, Carlos said. He taught a course called The Study of Deviant Behavior. That's the one, I agreed. Small world. I was going to be his disciple. He had a flock of students pending on his every word, much as a Zen master has students begging him to enlighten them. Did you become enlightened with his method? Carlos asked, teasing. I shook my head and took another bread from the bag. For a while I was really impressed with what he had to say, I admitted. I even became his research assistant without pay just so I could study his methods. I went to his office on Saturdays to assist him on a project. He was studying the natural flow of conversation and had a theory that the squeaks of guinea pigs were not random but a part of a complex system of coded communication. He had reels of tape recordings of guinea pig squeaks that he wanted me to decode and analyze according to his theoretical system. What happened? He asked. Did you discover a consistent pattern? I never stuck around long enough to find out, I said. One Saturday the professor came into the office where I was transcribing a tape of squeaks, and stood behind me for a while, making me believe he wanted to read over my shoulder, to see if a pattern was emerging. Then I felt him lean closer and start to blow in my hair. When I moved, he sat down next to me and put a long arm around my shoulder, pulled me to him and tried to kiss me. The old geezer had the gall to say he was certain I was interested in having an affair with him because I had come on Saturday to work when no one in their right mind works on Saturdays, but what cinched it for him was that I had told him I didn't expect to be paid for my work. Well, I only came because I genuinely thought he needed help and because I thought I could learn something from his methods. You see, I was having a romance with knowledge, but it was completely misinterpreted. What happened? Carlos asked expectantly. I shoved the heavy tape recording equipment off the table right into his lap. I was sure I crushed his guinea pig. You should have heard the squeals. Carlos looked at me curiously as if he didn't know what to think. I ran out of the office, and that was my last encounter with the professor of deviant behavior and with his deviant methods of sociology. Well, there is a lot to be said for the phenomenological method, Carlos continued, all deviant professors aside. As he talked, I nervously munched on bread, trying not to drop too many crumbs on the ground. For whenever crumbs fell, a host of greedy little black birds with yellow eyes and long tail feathers rushed to gobble them up. Carlos's elucidation seemed to have an immediate truth to it. As far as I could tell, experiencing things directly, without the intervention of idealizations, was what Clara and Mr. Abelar had meant when they said that the energetic body or double could experience realities directly which our reason could never comprehend. Take continuity of perception, for example, Carlos continued. According to phenomenologists, there is a continuity to perception, but it isn't a given. Perception itself is related only to the present. But this present is always seen in terms of having a past behind it and an open-ended future before it. I think I need a concrete example here, I said, trying to follow his explanation. Carlos pointed to the flowering jacaranda tree across the walkway near the gazebo. Take that tree over there, he said. You see that tree only here and now, but in seeing it, you are already presupposing that it was there yesterday in the same spot, and what's more, that it will continue to be there tomorrow even when we are no longer sitting on this bench observing it. I had to agree. That tree looked like it had been there quite a while. In fact, the blossoms on the ground proved it was there before we had sat down on the bench. The flowers on the ground, Carlos said, noticing my glance, attest to the fact that they were shed prior to us sitting down here on the bench, since we didn't see any of them fall. Your mind tells you that that tree has a history, even though you and I haven't been here long enough to perceive it directly. I know that tree has a history, I agreed. It didn't just materialize in front of our eyes this instant. Exactly, but how do you know that? How can you be so certain? That is the prime material for phenomenological investigation. What's more, I know that I am perceiving the same tree you are and that we are having an intersubjective agreement as to what constitutes reality, but can we really be certain that we are seeing the same things? A phenomenological approach would question that intersubjective agreement too, or at least, take such an a priori assumption into consideration in any discussion. My mind was reeling trying to imagine what the phenomenologists were up to. To me they were a kind of urban sorcerers, white magicians playing with mind and perception, much as the Clara and her group of sorcerers in Mexico had done while I was living among them. Only, to the phenomenologists, it seemed more of an intellectual game. They lacked the actual energetic force to make the jacaranda tree disappear in front of one's eyes upon realizing that its presence is mere interpretation. Nalita, Emilito, and Mr. Abelar, on the other hand, had the energy to make strange, inexplicable things happen by manipulating perception. While I was living in Clara's house, things kept disappearing and then I would find them weeks later in the same places I must have looked 100 times. What's more, features of her house would shift depending on my vantage point. I could never explain these occurrences and Clara had told me not to even try. It seemed very existential sitting on a park bench in a Mexican town, discussing the philosophy of Husserl, eating delicious bread, but somehow my mind kept flashing back to different questions. Not philosophical ones of whether or not the tree in the park exists in its own right or because we are perceiving it via a power called intentionality. Such talk seemed to me filled with overtones of Thomas Aquinas trying to figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I had had enough of that kind of talk from the Jesuit priests at the schools I had attended. I wanted to know more about Don Juan, Carlos's informant. Since he was also a sorcerer, perhaps he knew John Michael Abelar or of him. Then the thought struck me that perhaps he was Mr. Abelar, that he and Don Juan might be the same person. I wouldn't put anything past the sorcerers. I knew they existed on a different perceptual plane, one I was barred from by my lack of energy and understanding. Perhaps they were all there in the park with us and I was incapable of seeing them because I did not have the means for interpreting their perceptual reality. Perhaps the sorcerers, unlike the tree in the park, had no taken for granted history or future. Perhaps they lacked the temporality and spatiality of things, so, therefore, they didn't exist for us the way things in the world existed. Only an intentional analysis of the present, of perception in and of itself as making something present, Carlos continued, will give us an inkling of how we construct the world around us. Husserl called that living space, the life world, meaning life as it is lived in the present. I think I follow you, I said tentatively, wiping the crumbs off my fingers. But I need another example. Take that other tree, Carlos said, this time pointing to a beautiful magnolia dotted with white flowers. The tree gives itself to us as there, as fully present. Although I only see it from the front, I know that it has a back and sides even though I don't see them. So besides knowing that it has been there yesterday, as well as that it will be there tomorrow, I also know that it has sides and a back and an inside and long roots under the ground even though I don't immediately see them. That's what Husserl means by spatiality being built into perception. We assume the tree is there in all its fullness. True, I agreed, it's not just a flat facade. I see a complete tree. But that very completeness is an accomplishment, an activity, rather than a given, Carlos explained. In the tree's presence, in the very fact that we see it as a tree here and now, lies a continuity of what we are still conscious of, what had flowed away and what is no longer intuited at all. The tree has a continuity of past and future, resulting from the memory of the tree we saw yesterday, and the expectations we have that it will be there tomorrow. The tree's continuity is put there via our capacity for intentionality. We know it will be the same tree tomorrow as it is today, and it has spatiality, which allows us to see a front and a back and intuit its fullness. I took a sip of mineral water. Talking about phenomenology made me question perception. I had the certainty that if I gazed at that tree long enough, and if only I had enough sorcerer's energy, I could make it disappear, since it really didn't have a past or future, back or bottom other than the one incorporated in our interpretation of it. The tree wasn't there the way I saw it at all. Perception linked with mind, or what Brentano called intentionality, was playing a gigantic trick on the perceiver. I felt I wanted to get to the bottom of this charade once and for all. I was tired of being fooled by one particular mode of perceiving that had been forced upon me by virtue of the fact that I had been born into a particular life world or being in the world, as Husserl called it. I wanted more than anything to see the trees the way I had seen them under the guidance of Emilito, when I had climbed them, felt their roots, gazed at their leaves, talked to them, loved them, understood them, but now all that was gone as if the giant eye of that reality had closed and sealed that world from view, leaving me stranded on the wrong side of the door. If only Carlos could help me cross over to the other side. To understand sorcery is to expand one's capacity of perception, Mr. Abelar had once told me. Sorcerers, through the recapitulation and other practices, store enough energy to break the reflexivity of space and time. Their practices are deliberately geared towards disrupting the world as we live it. Now Carlos was saying the same thing, and I knew there must be an inherent truth to it. A sorcerer would look at that tree and not consider its there-ness as a given, Carlos continued. Sorcerers, according to Don Juan, try to break the mold of perception into which we were born. Do you think it's really possible to do that? I asked. I mean, break out of the mold of perceiving the world as we know it. Of course. According to Husserl, all perceptual acts point toward or intend some object, Carlos explained. In other words, all seeing is seeing something, all thinking is thinking something. All perception is perception of something, and perception projects itself toward its intended object, which is not a thing, or a given, but an act of creation, and as an act of creation, it can be recreated, or altered to fit a different mold. I get it. You're saying that as long as we see perception as a given, we are stuck, forever imprisoned, but if we realize that it is only phenomenon to be investigated, then different ways, or alternatives to perception open up. That's right, Carlos said. And who knows what lies in the realm of possibilities available to man as a sentient being. The sorcerer's path is to break the boundaries of social perception, Carlos said. And I say social perception, not human perception, because a sorcerer is able to perceive worlds not open to us as socialized beings, but which are, nevertheless, open as possibilities to sentient beings who have given up their social interpretations of the world as they live it. How did you get interested in studying perception? I asked Carlos. He was silent for a moment. It was a silence steeped in thought rather than one born out of having run out of things to say. After a while he said, "It was my good fortune to meet a man who, in my mind, is the most precise and remarkable person I've ever known. He has taken me as his apprentice and is teaching me to break the boundaries of perception. You see, you were right when you said in the office of the anthropology department that all this that is before us could not possibly be all there is to the world." He swept his hands in a graceful movement in front of us to include the trees, the cars, the boy on his bicycle and the people strolling around the plaza. There is a way to break through the barriers set up by language and thought, and perceive phenomena directly. That is what phenomenologists talk about, and that is what sorcerers actually do. I looked at Carlos. I knew why Emilito had insisted I attend the university. Not only so our paths would cross, but also so that I would have the capacity to conceptualize and share the new Nawal's predilection for the abstract. Carlos turned to look at me and our eyes fixed for an indescribable instant in which my entire future was summed up and my past rushed to meet the present. I couldn't put it into words, but in that moment, no one else in the world existed, and just as people had their own shared agreements, we held a moment of agreement, too, a silent intersubjectivity, to which no one else was privy. I let out a sigh of relief that seemed to have been trapped inside me for eons, for I knew beyond a doubt that this was the new Nawal. Fate had joined our paths, and forevermore we would journey together. "If you're game," Carlos said, breaking the silence. "We can blast through the world of perception. Let's find out if there is anything beyond this that we have always taken for granted." He laughed for a moment to break the seriousness, but I knew he meant what he said, and somewhere in the depth of silence I agreed. On that park bench I silently agreed to do whatever it took to accompany him to the ends of the earth and beyond. I leaned my head against his as if to merge forces. He reached up and tousled my hair the way Nalita had, and I knew our fates were sealed forever. We got up without any spoken words or promises, for none had to be made. We both knew at the deepest level that something had changed in the most subtle way. We were not the same as when we had sat down on the bench. We were joined by an intent that did not stem from the social order. It existed prior to our encounter in the office of the anthropology department, and prior yet, to the vision of another reality. Something else had set up our appointment on this park bench and made possible this journey of power, but what that force was, we could not fathom. For it originated within and emerged from the inconceivable depths of silence. Yet that same force would catapult us to freedom.